Oh, seen any good moves lately? Welcome back to Seeing the Good Moves Lately. I'm your host, Joey Olberding, and it's the Survivor off season. So I'm doing a little bit of a different type of mini podcast this time to talk about sort of my thoughts on the cast of Survivor 50 and really something I've noticed a lot in terms of reality TV returnee seasons, though, of course, I will be focusing on Survivor. And that is, of course, how returnee seasons are blatantly unfair. Almost all Survivor returnee seasons are unfair in its own way, in their own way. And I want to talk about why, because sure, there may be some examples, some reasons that feel somewhat obvious. Something that we're probably going to see in Survivor 50 and something that has been made famous by Survivor All Stars is the idea that if you are a winner and you're coming back onto a season, you are going to be a target. People don't want somebody to win two times in a row. People don't want that. People want to be like, okay, let's get rid of the person who we know is threatening and we know can win the game, and let's just get rid of them as soon as possible. A totally fair thought, totally fair argument, but it's a reason that maybe returnee seasons aren't the most fair. The other thing is there have been 9 returnee seasons to this point. At least I'm counting the Micronesias and the Caramones and the Blood versus Waters. And of course, those ones are definitely unfair because half of the cast is on a tribe with themselves, and the other half are people who have never played the game before. Frankly, those seasons feel like an excuse to have the fans or the loved ones not really have a chance and to crown a winner, somebody who has lost in the past who they want to win. And that can be sort of true of, Philippines or Redemption Island or South Pacific as well, to its own extent, though. I'm not counting them for the idea of the returnee seasons, even though maybe some of the points that I'm making in this podcast could potentially work there as well. But that's not really the main reason why I'm doing this. I think there's something that the early returnee seasons of Survivor get right. They're really good at pinpointing this, but it's something that maybe due to the increase of the amount of seasons that we have has sort of faded into the background and maybe sort of been forgotten about. And that is the idea of parity in Survivor returnee seasons. The idea of people being on the same playing field. What do I mean by that? Well, think about it. In Survivor All Stars, there were 7 seasons to come beforehand, and every season is represented. And every season except for two, that being Thailand and Pearl Islands, which was right beforehand, have multiple contestants on that. What does that mean? Even just bypassing the idea of prior relationships due to friendships formed on Survivor, due to charity events that people went to, everybody on the beach in Survivor All Stars, except for Sheehan and Rupert, had an advantage because they already had a prior relationship with at least one other contestant on the beach. And that is a powerful thing. It's a very powerful thing. And I really truly believe that that is a reason why Survivor All Stars is a very fascinating season. I don't think it's a good one, but it is a fascinating season in the sense that everybody has a prior relationship. So those relationships get ruined. That's how we get the Boston Robs and the Lexes of the world. That's how we get Lex saying to Ethan, I can't take you further in this game. And Kathy crying because she considered Boston Rob a son to her. That is, if nothing else, very interesting television. It's not particularly great in terms of the viewing experience potentially, but it's interesting for that alone. And so it's hard not to give credit to that for what it's worth. But the more seasons that exist, the harder it is to really do that. I think about Micronesia. Micronesia is already sort of imperfect, sort of imbalanced because of the very nature of okay, yes, half the people on the season are fans. Some of them may be very casual fans, but they're all fans of the show. They know who Rupert is, they know who Ozzy is, etc., etc. But there's some blatant unfairness, and this is kind of true of every All Star season, and it's going to be true of Survivor 50 as well, where there are prior relationships that exist, but there are also prior relationships that nobody on the cast knows about. That being James and Amanda, in Survivor Micronesia, where they're just coming off of Survivor China. They are known to be somewhat tight. I mean, Amanda was part of the vote out against James, kind of. But, for the most part, they still got along swimmingly in Survivor China overall. But nobody on the cast of Micronesia really knows anything about either of the two of them. And so the two of them, are in a premier power position in the tribe, James especially, because here you have on this Returnee tribe, you have mostly people who have played with each other to some extent, which I like. I mean, I like that. That's a good thing. You have like Amy and Eliza working together. They were on the same season. You have, Penner and Parvati. You have people who have worked with each other, but there are also a few people who are by themselves. And this is what's interesting to me is there are people like Yowman, who gets voted out very early. Johnny Fairplay, who's the first person voted out. They're by themselves. Now, to be fair, Sari is by herself. She makes it to the final three. Probably would have won if it were a final three. So, it's not perfect, but here's the thing. James and Amanda practically had a secret alliance. I mean, people knew that they were on the same season, but practically a secret alliance. But if you just look at the physicality, James isn't going to get voted out by his tribe anyway. He is this big, huge, massive a man, and he is essential in challenges. And Amanda, for her, is also great in challenges, at least compared to maybe some of the other women. Like some other people were not as good in challenges as Amanda was. But that's all to say that that trio of things, the strength of the competitors themselves, the season they were on being directly before Micronesia, and the fact that they were working together, and four, that nobody had that perception of them, and five, I'm just adding numbers, and five, the fact that half the cast hadn't played before, makes something like Survivor Micronesia an inherently unfair season. Of course, Amanda didn't end up winning, so, is this really true? But you look at who she lost to. She lost to Parvati, who had two other people from her original season on her original tribe. That's a powerful thing. And in a sense, I think Micronesia is actually better than All Stars in terms of parity. When you think about the idea of, okay, there are no winners on Micronesia. They learned from their mistakes with All Stars, where Jenna Lewis is talking openly in Survivor All Stars about how we need to target all the winners (parentheses and Rob Cesternino). So they learned from that in terms of casting. So I appreciate that, but also half the cast is not people who played before, so it didn't really fix the problem. But I think it's interesting to look at how Survivor cast kind of tried to adjust after a period of, okay, we haven't done this. And I'm sure the captain seasons in Survivor Guatemala, which is behind me, add a part to that as well. And I really don't know necessarily what. I mean, Stephanie makes it very far. She almost wins. Bobby John makes it to the jury, I think. Yeah, he makes it to. I really can't remember. Yeah, he makes it to the jury. So they improve it there, but I think their sweet spot is sort of the sweet spot that most people would agree with, just kind of in terms of Survivor in general, which of course is heroes versus villains. And here's why heroes versus villains is an especially good cast of this. Sure, it has some winners, but it has enough winners, but it also has winners that have played with other people. And that's something that was true of Survivor All Stars as well, but there's a little more wiggle room. And of course, we get that with, Sandra eventually winning. But you look at the cast, and everybody has some sort of ally in the game for the most part. There's really, I don't really know if there is an exception. The only exception is Danielle, who, you know, wasn't exactly a barn burner, but, think about it. Shane was an alternate. I think Shane was supposed to be on the season even, but wasn't. So she was going to have somebody to be paired with as well. The only other person is Russell Hantz, who sure doesn't have that ally, but he also has the advantage of nobody's seen him before, which is probably and in fact, certainly a very big reason for why he got to the end again, is the fact that nobody knew how he played. But everybody else, whether they're on the same side to begin with or the other side, has at least one person that's played with them before. Sugar goes out first, but she has Randy on the other side, who, I mean, actively hates her, but I mean, that's some connection on the season that she was on. Stephanie gets voted out second, but she has Tom Westman riding for her like the entire time. Suri has a lot of connections, and that's sort of maybe the most unfair nature of it is like some people just blatantly have more connections than others, but I don't really think that's a huge deal when there are connections everywhere. And that's why I think Heroes versus Villains really works. I mean, there's a lot of reasons it really works. It's not just the casting decisions, but I think the parody in terms of everybody having sort of an equal, having somebody that I can be like, hey, yeah, Parvati, we were on Micronesia together. Make sure not to play that idol. Aha. I think it's good, but it also has enough people who are separated from each other so that it doesn't create just like a bond together or like, an automatic alliance, which kind of happens in Survivor All Stars. Uh, that doesn't really happen here, which I think is a good thing. There's a world where it could have happened. A lot of Micronesia people are here, All Stars people are here, but it's obviously a good thing that it didn't. Part of that, might just be the fact that it was so Russell Hance like focused. Maybe there's a little more of that than we got in the edit, but I think it's pretty interesting regardless. But for the most part, it's very parody y. Though the problem also from that stems with, well, some people who played with each other are on the same tribe and some of them are on the opposites. You think about what I just said about Sugar and Randy, they were on opposite tribes versus, I don't know, you look at like Rupert. Rupert was on All Stars with Colby. They end up being the last two heroes in the game. You look at Amanda. She was well, she was on with James. She was on with James in Micronesia and China. We were just talking about that, and once again, they're on the same tribe together. So it's stuff like that that sort of makes me go a little okay. Well, I don't know about that, but obviously, Heroes versus Villains is still an amazing season, and it has great casting all around. And I think a large part of why the season works is the fact that there are just enough connections so that it spices up the game, but not so many that it overwhelms. And I like that. The next returnee season is Survivor Karamoan. And the interesting thing about Karamoan is that it is better than Micronesia in some senses, but also way worse than Micronesia in others. And I'll explain why. So, once again, you have half the cast not knowing anybody. But the only person that returns, it's not two people like Micronesia. The only person is Malcolm, which is a little better in terms of, okay, sure, Malcolm, guy that people don't know, he is probably going to do well regardless. Sort of the James and Amanda problem from before because he's this athletic young guy, probably the best challenge competitor on the returnee tribe. But, it's better than having an automatic alliance that people don't really know what that entails, like was the case in Micronesia. The problem stems from the separation in terms of experience that people have with one another on the season. There were three people on the returnee tribe from Survivor Redemption Island alone. There are a lot of people who are just by themselves on the returnee tribe at the same time. Corinne is by herself. Brenda's by herself. Eric's by himself. It's not perfect for sure. So there are three people from Redemption Island, three people from South Pacific as well. There's Don, Cochran, and Brandon. And so it creates a very uneven sort of playing field where there's six people combined from two seasons, and then everybody else is sort of left to fend for themselves among everything else. So it's not the worst, but it's not the best. I will say part of it is uh, sort of weird because there are rivalries interlaced within this tribe where Philip and Francesca, as he calls her, are going up against each other, and she eventually ends up being the first boot. And South Pacific kind of has that too with Brandon and Cochran. And, well, that's not really a rivalry as much, but it is something that, as we know, ends up coming to a head, at least with Brandon. So it's not the worst. Meanwhile, with Micronesia, everybody kind of likes each other. And there's really not the biggest thing is maybe like Penner and I don't know, maybe Parvati, but that's definitely a stretch. It didn't really end up coming to a head and mattering anyways. Here, there's a lot more tension, and I think that that's probably on purpose, but it's hard to really say. Either way, I think I'm a Caramone defender. I will always be a Caramone defender. I think it's a great season of Survivor. Not a good season, a great season. But it is sort of uneven in its own way that Micronesia isn't. But it's also more fair in the sense that there's less of an inherent advantage given to Malcolm, even though maybe he shouldn't have been on the season. Survivor's obsession with bringing back people immediately after they played before is something people have complained a lot about with Survivor 50, and I get it. I agree. I'm with you all. You are correct. Um, Regardless, I think that it's okay. But the one that I think is my favorite, even more than Heroes versus Villains, is Blood versus Water. And a lot of that comes from concept alone, but it doesn't all come from concept alone. I honestly adore it. I think it's so good because everybody immediately has a connection. And it's a connection that, unlike even a James and Amanda, people want to play with their loved ones. People want to play with that person. It's different from even like Amanda and Parvati or something like that, where you start on opposite tribes and you come together because, like, sure, those two people played before, but you never know what the tribe dynamics will create. With Blood versus Water, it's like, okay, but do you really want to vote out your mom? That's sort of a step beyond the game. So I think Blood versus Water is the best season in terms of parity. But it's also not necessarily perfect. Once again, you have half people who have not played Survivor. That by itself could maybe get you disqualified from being the best. In fact, maybe it should. Heroes versus Villains would probably be the best otherwise, but go with me for a second. So everybody has a connection immediately, and that is the very nature of the game. Everybody's on the same playing field. Beyond that, it's really not that bad in terms of parity. Like, part of it is sort of imperfect because of the immediate let's vote somebody out. But like even Candace, who was an alternate on the season, wasn't supposed to play. It was supposed to be RC. Her only real connection is Rupert, and they were on the same tribe in Heroes versus Villains. But I mean, Candace sort of betrayed Rupert in that season, so it's not perfect whatsoever. Tina and Rupert were on the same tribe for a second in All Stars, like barely, like an actual blip. There's some connections from One World. There's actually three people on the same tribe from One World, and I could make the same argument that I did for Karamo and why it's imperfect and sort of weird, but I will not do that because the people that get brought back for One World seem like so random. Like the biggest connection is Kat and Colton, but Colton's there for like a second. Like he's basically just a vehicle to have Caleb on the season, and he does not want to be there. So essentially, for my money's worth, it's just Monica and Kat, which is such a random pairing that it's like, okay, well, no, but that's not going to be a connection in the season. And in fact, it doesn't end up being a connection in the season. And everybody else is just completely disconnected from everyone else, which I absolutely love. I mean, Tyson was also on Heroes versus Villains, but I mean, he got voted out pre-merge. He never interacted with Rupert. He never interacted with Candace. I mean, I'm sure that, they talked at some point. I'm sure a lot of these people talked at some point. You can't really stop that from happening, especially once rumors of the cast and the sequestering and whatnot are starting to happen. Like, it's only natural. Regardless, I love Blood versus Water for that because it incentivizes everybody's number one ally to be their loved one or to create a new connection and, make that on the show instead of being like, well, Candace, we were on Heroes versus Villains together. We should go to the end together. It's more interesting than that, and I love that because it also creates connections. Like I don't know if you've heard of this, but Sierra Easton voting out her mom, which say what you will about that. It's very overhyped, but it is really interesting, fascinating television when you look at it from a casting perspective, because that's exactly what the casting wanted, and it's exactly what they got. So there you go. The next returnee season is Survivor Cambodia, and this is also an interesting one because this is also a season that really doesn't have that much of connections. There are some seasons that have a lot. There are some seasons that have a lot. Same one, Del Sur has three, I think, and some don't. You know, Kelly Wigglesworth is the only person from Borneo on the season. Like it's a little unfair in that sense, but for the most part, it's relatively close because I mean the people pick the cast, so it was never really going to be that fair by itself. I think and that's kind of something that I have to keep in mind when it comes to this because like the cast could have been completely different. You could have had Shane and Terry both on the season, for instance. You could have had T Bird instead of I don't know Jeff Garner, which would have been cool. But stuff like that. There's a sense of like okay, well you kind of get what you get. It's not really on the casting as much as it is on the people, and plenty of articles and stuff and podcasts have been talked about how the fans voted in the wrong people in Second Chance. Look, here's my thought. My thought is Second Chance is the best season of Survivor. I like it more than Heroes versus Villains. But how much of it is because of the casting? I don't really know. I think sort of like Blood versus Water, a lot of the reasons for why it's interesting television comes more from the dynamics than anything else. The dynamics of people voted me in to do well in Survivor. I think, and this is my second opportunity, maybe my only opportunity. I have to make the most of it. I think really means something and really pushes people forward and works with the narrative of the season that I think makes the season play out the way it does. And in my opinion, creates a really, really, really good season of television. And Heroes versus Villains is the same way. I'm a hero. I'm a villain. I will adjust my behavior based on this. And Blood versus Water is the same way. And if that's ever a reason to keep theming around for a season, there you go. So there you go. It's kind of hard to talk about Cambodia. It exists in a sort of weird vacuum when it comes to all these other seasons, but I mean, it does. So there you go. The next one is Game Changers, and I already know what you're saying. Oh, Game Changers, awful, hate it. Well, I will say Game Changers, other than All Stars, is probably the worst returnee season, at least in my opinion. Once again, I'm a carry mode defender. However, once again, the parody here is pretty okay for what it's worth. Think about it like this. At this point in Survivor history, it is no longer Survivor All Stars. There are not only 7 seasons to look back on. We now have 33 seasons to look back on. So creating parody is really hard. However, for the most part, they do it. Much like Heroes versus Villains or some other season, every season has somebody who every season has at least two people. Every player has at least one connection in the game. You think about Sierra, first boot. Oh man, she must not have had great connections. She must have been in a bad spot. She has two connections from Blood versus Water by itself, and she has 3 connections from Cambodia. So pretty good. But she goes home first because maybe it's because she seems so well connected. Maybe it's just because of the way that she was. I mean, the episode gives us reasons, of course, but I'm looking beyond that. I'm looking at what does anything about the casting scream this person has to go or this person has to go? And to me, it's like that doesn't really happen. That's not something that we really see in Game Changers. It's not because of the casting that people go home. Sure, people might not want to reward Tony Vlachos with $1 million again at that time. And so that's why he gets voted out second, or people might not, blah, blah, blah with JT, things like that exist. And that's part of the reason why Survivor seasons will never be fair. These returnee seasons. That's why I'm making this podcast. That's why we're talking about this. But regardless, if you look through the cast list, everybody has some sort of connection. Heck, even Hallie Ford has a connection with fan favorite Game Changer Zero Don Thomas, of course. The problem is maybe a little bit in the sense that okay, you brought back Zeke and you brought back Michaela. That's sort of the same problem that we had with Micronesia, so many seasons to keep track of. With Micronesia, where it's like these people were on the same tribe, but the difference between James and Amanda is as Zeke and Michaela got swapped to different tribes, and then Michaela got voted out. So it's like slightly different. They were connected, I guess. They're on the same tribe, but they were actually never on the same tribe in Game Changers until the merge, which I think matters. I think that does matter, and that makes it better, in my opinion, than Micronesia maybe. But it still creates maybe a little bit of unfairness when it comes to the rest of the cast. But I think less because it's also a 20-person season. Micronesia is too, but it's also everybody is a returnee versus the 10 people that are returnees in Micronesia, which I think is sort of the main difference there. So it's not as bad. And you really look at all the game changers. The only person that isn't connected is, funnily enough, Troyzan, uh, which is funny to me because, if you just went on a few returnee seasons prior, if you just went on for Blood versus Water, hey, you would be one happy camper. You'd be fine. You would be among your people. You'd be among a lot of people who you screamed at them that it was your eye, not theirs. But I mean, there you go. It might be a little better for you, but hey, he made the end anyways. So I don't know if he's going to be complaining too much about that. So wait, well, let's think about this. Wait a second. Things are actually looking pretty good. We have a lot of parity. It's actually a lot better than you might think it were just based on thinking about what is fair and what is unfair. And the next returnee season, the last one that we have had, should be the exact same way. It's Survivor Winners at War. Everybody, with the exception of Sandra, has won once. And sure, there might be some connections, like Amber and Rob are married, but there really aren't that many problems when it comes to these connections, are there? Well, this is where we get into dicey territory because yes, there are definitely problems associated with it. In fact, we see it in episode one what the problems are, and that is when there's not enough parity, or when there is a lot of parity, I should say. When it's obvious when there isn't parity, it immediately becomes a reason to target someone. We see that in episode one when Natalie Anderson and Jeremy Collins are on the same tribe. They worked very closely in San Juan del Sur, and immediately it's like this is a tight duo that we won't be able to break up, who are together, who are both winners. We need to separate them fast. And they lose the first challenge, and they're like, well, Jeremy is probably stronger than Natalie, even though I don't really think that's true. So I guess we'll get rid of Natalie. And so they get rid of Natalie. And that's the reason. The reason is because these people who had a prior connection were on the same tribe. And that also happens to Amber. But it's not because they're on the same tribe. It's because, oh yeah, she's married to another person on the season, sort of bringing back the blood versus water thing for two specific castaways of, yeah, you're not going to be able to separate these two. So she goes home, or I guess she goes to Edge immediately, and it's her and Natalie are the first two on Edge of Extinction purely because of their pregame connections. And part of that also manifests itself with Danny, who goes home next because she, on the other side of the equation, had no pregame connections. So that also hurt her game. That's really something that when a lot of people talk about, well, Winners at War didn't like blah 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 about Winners at War. A lot of that is because, well, the old schoolers got demolished. They all went home first, and the new schoolers reigned supreme. There are a few reasons for that. I think most of it, as people would kind of agree, is the newer people naturally have more connections than the older school players because they've played more recently. They've gone to the events, they went to the finales, etc., etc. They've done their charity work more recently than maybe Danny has. And I think that matters. I do. I will say that that's not the reason why the season starts out the way it does. Sure, once alliances get formed and dynamics start happening, the game starts being played, and maybe these prior connections don't matter as much. But there's an asterisk there when it comes to, okay, what's the story of Winners at War? Oh, it's the prior connection between Tony and Sarah. that's the reason, essentially, why the game comes down to the fire making challenge between Tony and Sarah is they have this strong cop connection that goes back to Kagayan, and they are strong, and they've been with each other, and they said, you know what, cops are us for real this time. And it gets them to the end because they had this prior connection that everybody knew about, and they just didn't do anything about it. And that was something that nobody else could say because it's just unfair. It's a little more powerful than what everybody else can do. You look at, say, I don't know, maybe somebody who did decently well. Let's look at Sophie. Big Sophie fan. She's great. She didn't have that connection. She didn't have that connection to anybody else that, you know, Tony and Sarah naturally did. They had that. Sophie did not. She had to play harder than they did. In a sense, Tony's win is still the best win in Survivor history, in my opinion. But she had to do things that Tony and Sarah didn't have to do. They could look at each other and be like, hey, we're working together till the end because, we know each other and we can do that. And because they weren't targeted for that, unlike Jeremy and Natalie and Amber and Rob, they get to the end, one of them wins. So, yes, I would say that that is blatantly unfair. And a large part of that is because of how Winners at War turns out. That's not necessarily something that is completely unique to other seasons. I mean, if somebody from Survivor One World had won Blood versus Water, if Monica had won and she went to the end with Kat, we would probably be saying the same thing. But that's just not something that's really happened otherwise. I'm just thinking about it. I mean, yeah, not really. So it's a little different, and it really leaves a somewhat sour taste in my mouth for a great season, in my opinion. That is Winners at War, where it's like, okay, this is all harping on a connection that almost nobody else in this game could have had. When it's supposed to be the most parody-y season of Survivor, it's something blatantly unfair that shifts the tide and sort of helps create the dynamics for why the season goes the way it does. So that brings me to Survivor 50. Survivor 50 has gotten a lot of buzz, as it should, being this culmination, this big, big season all about, hey, these are the legends of the game. Even though they haven't really said that, it is implied that these are people who we want to see back, who are in their own way worth seeing again. And when it comes to the cast, a lot of people have been fired up. Why bring so many returnee players, or why bring so many new era players back? Can't we just have legends of the game? Can't we have people from the 20s? Can't we have more people like that? And totally fair. I don't necessarily disagree. I don't think it's as big of a deal as people say it is. I understand it, but if you want to look at what will create a good season of Survivor, the thing I am worried about isn't necessarily there's a lot of people from the new era. The thing that I'm worried about is there's a lot of people from the same seasons on here. And there's also a lot of people who are completely disconnected from everybody else in terms of who they've played with. You just look at the new era returnees. You've got Joe, Kyle, and Camilla from Survivor 48. That's a trio already. And I'm not saying that that's going to be a close trio, but these are three people who worked until the final four together, essentially. So that would probably be a connection, and probably something people look to getting rid of Camilla or Kyle, maybe Joe because of. We'll see. In addition, you look at the season prior, Survivor 47. Oh, sure, there's probably going to be quite a few people from that season as well, right? There's one person. It's Genevieve. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Well, all right. Then what about Survivor 46? Oh, Survivor 46. That also has three people. What is happening? Huh? Well, okay. I guess this is just normal. I guess maybe it's just like very wide discrepancies. 45. Oh, we have two players. Okay. Okay. So this is just a new era thing, right? This is just new era season. So I guess they're just people from every new era season. Ooh, not quite. There's nobody from Survivor 41, 43, or 44. Oh, and by the way, there's one person from Survivor 42. So immediately, just in the new era, there is a lot of disconnect from just the power of people versus one another, which I certainly don't like. Makes me concerned. It makes me feel like there's already going to be pregame strategy just with purely how the numbers go. But at the same time, this is kind of what happened in Micronesia too, and that didn't end up being a big deal. This is definitely sort of what happened in Karamoan, and depending on your thoughts about that season, that can either be something that turned out okay or something that turned out very disastrous indeed. But the difference between this and say Karamoan is Karamoan had volatile personalities that made this up. 46 kind of has that just because it has Q and he's a force of chaos. But you look at Survivor 48, which people are very annoyed by its large presence in the season. I don't mind that by itself. Blood versus Water, one of my favorite seasons, has three people from one world. It's got Monica, who ends up kind of being the chaotic force on that season. You have Kat, who is kooky. She's kooky. She's silly. And then you have Colton, who is sort of just an atomic bomb waiting to blow up. And it's like, okay, these are people from a bad season of Survivor who three returnees in one season. Like, surely that doesn't work. And in some sense, it doesn't. Like, Colton probably shouldn't have been there. Definitely shouldn't have been there, but he is. But the season still turns out great, and it still works. But the difference between One World and 48 is 48 is not a bad season necessarily because of the things that happen in it. It's the things that don't happen in it. And I wouldn't even call it bad. I mean, no Survivor season is truly awful television. A lot of them get very close, but usually it's just individual episodes that are really bad for the most part. The worst a Survivor season is boring, but sometimes it gets bad. And Survivor 48 was mostly just boring, and it was disappointing in the sense that the edit didn't show us what was really happening with the contestants because, in my opinion, they wanted to perpetuate the narrative of Joe and Eva so hard, and they did that. And it's a nice moment. Gets the two of them on Good Morning America or whatever, blah 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 blah. But the problem from that now stems from like, okay, none of these people are volatile. Joe at most is like a bit too honor and integrity y, but that's going to be the opposite of stopping from somebody from working with him. It's only going to make people want to work with him more. And Kyle and Camilla prove themselves to be great allies to one another, like incredible allies. That's completely different from the one world situation. This is just three people who are like good allies and you want to work with. There's no opportunity to get rid of someone. There's no conflict in there like there was for the Redemption Island people in Karamoan. There's no Philip and Francisqua or whatever, blah blah blah. But it's that's what annoys me. But the thing is that it doesn't just exist with that season. It exists with David versus Goliath too. Because in David versus Goliath with Angelina, who, boy, such a chaotic force, right? You got Christian, and you have third person, Mike White, yeah. And that exists in the quote unquote old era as well. And it's like, yes, I agree. You should bring back people from David versus Goliath. That's a good thing. I don't mind that. I don't mind any of their presences on the season. But I think the same problem that exists with Survivor 48 and to some extent Survivor 46 exists with David versus Goliath because Mike White and Christian, sure, they have their quirks, but they're at the end of the day good loyal allies. And Angelina is like, oh, such a chaotic force, the most chaotic force. She negotiates for Rice. For the most part, very loyal ally, very, very somebody that you can definitely trust with, and build a good working relationship with. She isn't an Abby Maria; she's an Angelina. There's a difference. And so that's where my concern is, especially with the old era. The new era, it's like, okay, everybody's probably connected to some extent. But you look at some of the other people to come back from the old era, especially the people who are especially sort of disconnected from everyone else. Jenna's going to be the person who has had the longest break between seasons of anybody. It used to be Ethan, now it's going to be Jenna. She last played in Survivor All Stars. Let me do a little quick bit of math. Oh yeah, that's 42 seasons ago. That's a while. That's quite a while indeed. And sure, I guess she has the connection to like Colby, but Is the Jenna Colby connection from 20 years ago gonna matter? I doubt it. Beyond that, you got like Chrissy. She'll be a very interesting case because she hasn't played, in 10 years, but she also isn't really that active in the Survivor community, and she doesn't have anybody else on her season because, it's heroes versus healers versus hustlers. It's not a good season. So that's something too. It's like there's a big disconnect, especially since there's a lot of people who have only played once, especially from the old era. But there's also a few people that have played a lot. Like, is Stephanie going to naturally be in a better position than, say, a Jenna just because she's played one more time? Is Coach going to be in a better position because he's played 3 times versus Chrissy's only played once? These are the things that I think will be interesting about the season. It's much more akin to game changers than any other season where there's a lot of discrepancy and a lot of variables and how many times somebody's played. JT played 3 times, Sarah played 1 time, stuff like that. So I think that'll be interesting. I will say it is probably the season, at least not of the half returnee seasons like Micronesia and whatever else, that has the worst parity on paper of any returnee season, which makes me very worried. I do think all the contestants will probably bring it, probably more than people did in Game Changers, because it's the 50th season. Once again, going with the narrative, the fans voted for how the season goes. There's a lot of question marks about what advantages will be in the game if there will be fire making, which I think will be interesting. At the end of the day, depending on what we all voted on, it might be annoying and we might regret some of our choices, a la Second Chance. But regardless, I think it'll be interesting. And I hope that whatever we voted for and whatever Survivor 50 is like from a season perspective can make up from what the cast looks like. I like the cast itself. I think it's like a solid B. But at the end of the day, I don't know if by itself that will be enough to save the season. Just, enjoying that Mike White is coming back or Emily Flippin is coming back. I don't know if that's going to make up seeing them on television for how the season is actually structured. I'll be excited to see the tribe dynamics, but for now, that's all I got. Hope you enjoyed this short little podcast of my thoughts on Survivor casting throughout the years with returnee seasons. And if you like this, make sure to let me know, and I'll do more, or maybe I won't. We'll see. But for now, thank you and goodbye.